War. War is hell, and none were as hellish as the First World War. Troops from all over their respective home countries were sent off to die for king and country, and while there were some who suffered terrible fates overseas far away from home, the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots suffered one of their most tragic losses before they'd even left home. On the 22nd of May 1915, 500 men of the 7th Battalion Royal Scots boarded a train headed for port after they were called to fight in Gallipoli. It was around 6:30 in the morning as they travelled up the line to Carlisle. Around that same time, George Meakin, the night signalman, was still working the signals at a set of passing loops between Gretna Junction and Kirkpatrick. James Tinsley arrived around this time, who was supposed to start his shift in the signal box at 6 AM. It was a common practice for early morning signalmen to arrive 30 or so minutes late to avoid the need to wake up so early to get to work, provided they had informed the night signalman beforehand. This practice, however, was usually against company rules, despite most signalmen doing it. On this day, George Meakin had agreed to cover the extra 30 minutes for James Tinsley. A quick lesson on passing loops. They're basically a small siding that allows for slower trains to move out of the way so that faster or more important trains can pass. Once the faster train has passed by, the slow train can continue out of the siding and carry on its way. There is also an additional set of points between the up and down lines to allow trains to shunt from one line to the other, should the passing loop be full and nothing is coming the other way. On this day, a goods train was taking up space in the downline siding, and a local passenger train needed to be shunted to allow for an express to pass by. Meakin had shunted the passenger train onto the upline to allow the express to go by, and had to move a train of empty coal wagons into the upline siding to allow the troop train to overtake it. Around this time, Tinsley showed up to start his shift. Meakin had written all the notes for the logbook on a scrap of paper, so Tinsley could copy them in, so it seemed he arrived at 6 o'clock and wouldn't get into trouble. This is where it all went wrong. Both guards from the stopped coal trains had entered the signal box to sort paperwork, while Meakin was reading a newspaper, making conversation with everyone about the paper's reports on the war. All four men began discussing the war, which distracted Tinsley, who was so busy sorting signals and copying notes that he forgot about the local passenger train still on the upline. Ironically, it was the same train he had used to get to work. He set the upline to all clear to allow the train of the Royal Scots troops to advance. Meakin should have placed a safety lock on the signal lever, which would have prevented it from being set to clear while the passenger train was still stood on the line. At 6:49 AM, the troop train ran headfirst into the stationary passenger train. While many were injured and some were killed, worse came in the form of the second northbound express, thundering along the down line towards the wreckage. The train had already passed a signal before it could be set to danger, and as such couldn't stop in time. Both locomotives pulling the express collided with the ruined carriages, furthering the size of the mess. Both of the goods trains that were parked in the sidings also ended up getting tangled in the wreck. Unfortunately, the worst of the accident was yet to come. Let me remind you, this was wartime. Railways needed all the rolling stock they could get. As such, many troop trains and supply trains were made up of old or hastily made up rolling stock. The Great Central Railway carriages that were carrying the troops were old and had been hastily put back into service. They were built with wooden frames and had little in the way of crash protection. On top of that, they were lit with gas lighting, with the gas stored under the frames of the carriages. The ruined carriages soon caught fire, leaving many of the troops trapped in the burning wreck as 15 of the 21 troop carriages went up in flames, along with the goods wagons and other passenger carriages. Firefighters, doctors, and even a couple that owned a nearby shop ran over to help who they could, but the fire was blazing bright and spreading fast. The fire was so hot it consumed all the coal in the tenders of the locomotives. Some men had to be swiftly amputated to free them from the wreckage. It's never been confirmed, but it's said that some soldiers who couldn't be rescued took their own lives or begged to be shot instead of having to suffer the pain of being burnt alive. An officer who had gotten out unscathed took to shooting some of the men trapped in the fire. Some younger soldiers fled the scene while they had the chance to get out of fighting. It took hours for the fire to eventually die down, and it wasn't extinguished until the next morning. After the accident, a total of 246 people were injured and 229 people had died. Of the 229 people, 9 were passengers, 3 were railway employees, and 4 were children. The other 214 were all soldiers, most of whom died from the fire. Most of the troops aboard had come from the same town of Leith. Pretty much everyone in the town knew at least one of the men who had died so close to home. Of the bodies, 83 could be identified, 82 were recovered but unrecognizable, and 50 were missing altogether, having been cremated in the blaze. The total was 215, but later amended by the army to be 214. The men were buried in a mass grave with full military honours after being given a proper funeral. All surviving officers were sent to Liverpool the next day, but only 6 officers were deemed fit enough to depart overseas. Both George Meakin and James Tinsley were arrested and sentenced to several years of prison time. Both, however, were eventually let out a year later as the UK was still at war and needed every pair of hands it could spare. With only 58 men out of 500 in good health after the accident, that part of the 7th Battalion remained in Scotland. A memorial remains in place at the Rosebank Cemetery listing the names of all those who had died. War is a tragic thing, and it's always important to remember that not every great loss happens on the front lines.